Welcome everybody to our webinar. We're so excited that you're joining us. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We'll just give it a few moments before we jump right in. Welcome, welcome everybody. Welcome. Welcome. If you want to put in the chat box where you're from and what you're hoping to learn, feel free to do that in the chat box. Go ahead and put where are you from and what do you hope to learn. Welcome everybody. We're so excited that you are here to join us. I'm just gonna wait probably one more minute for people to come in. But in the chat box, you can click to everyone, and this will allow you to send your message to everybody. Just click the drop-down box in the chat box and just write where you're from and what do you hope to learn from our session. Welcome, welcome, welcome everybody. We're so excited that you're here to join us. Go ahead in the chat box, drop where you're from and what do you hope to learn from our session today. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started just in the essence of time. But as you come in, drop where you're from. And you can also drop in the chat box what you hope to learn. My name is Dr. Anise Fisher. I'm the founder and CEO of Developing Capacity Coaching. And I have joining us today two amazing guests. The first person I want to introduce is Dr. C.G. Ann Heiser. C.G. is our Senior Impact Advisor. She and I have a 10-year working history together. She oversees all of our assessment, our evaluations. How do we not only ensure that DCC is measuring our impact with equity, but how do we also help our partners measure that, as well as our communications and marketing? So if you've seen us a lot more online on Instagram and LinkedIn, that's Dr. Heiser's doing. Next, I would like to introduce Beverly Harris. Beverly and I have known each other for a few years. Beverly is a coach affiliate with Developing Capacity Coaching. She works in North Carolina at Duke University. But one of the things we're excited to have Beverly join us with here today is that she's a seasoned discrimination and harassment investigation officer who has led this effort internal to her department at Duke. She's led this regionally, she's led this locally, and she's led this for a variety of statewide associations. And so we're bringing together a knowledge and expertise that's both our perspective as developing capacity, but also someone who has sat in the seat as the person for who is in charge of investigations within organizations. When we begin all of our webinars, we like to start with the land and labor acknowledgement. For us, the land and labor acknowledgement is our stake in the ground of solidarity with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. While we understand that us making the statement acknowledging the lands that we stand on in Chicago doesn't return the land back to them, but it does say that we believe in reparations and the restoration of wealth and family bonds and the restoration of resources that were taken from our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We also do a labor acknowledgement to acknowledge the enslaved peoples who built the fabric of this country, the financial institutions of this country that we often don't get a chance to pay homage to. And so with that, we're going to invite you to center yourselves with us in this space. So I'm going to lead us through 3 deep breaths. As we're going through these deep breaths, I'm going to ask you to consider what I've just stated about the land and labor acknowledgement, but also I'm going to ask you to consider bringing yourselves fully into this space. I know that you could have used your time in a lot of different ways, but you've chose to be here with us. And so we want to invite you into our space. So I'm going to invite you to take 3 deep breaths. You can close your eyes or leave them open. Inhale in. Exhale. As you exhale, consider allowing the breath to flow through your teeth as a way to slow release. So we're going to inhale in. Exhale. We're going to take one more deep breath to bring us into the space. Inhale in. Exhale. Okay. Thank you for taking some time to come into the space. So what we're going to do during our time together is to talk to you about ways that you can effectively address racial incidents from a healing and reconciliation lens. And then I'm going to talk to you about the ACT part of our Act Now framework. So this is a 2-part webinar series with Beverly, myself, and CG. The first Part 1, we're going to focus on the ACT, the ACT, and then in July, we'll focus on the Now. And what we believe is that if you lean into this session and take notes and utilize the handout that Dr. Heiser will drop in the chat box later on in our session, you will be able to make a plan for how to use this in your practice. And developing capacity, I would say at the heart of what we do is to coach people to trust themselves to effectively lead for equity and justice. So a part of us starting this webinar series was our belief in wanting to build the capacity of people nationally and internationally, that even if their organization doesn't decide to invest in this work, they can come to this webinar and learn some effective strategies for how to lead for equity and justice in their workplaces, at home, or in their families. So what you're going to experience in this webinar today is an example of our capacity building, where we're going to come alongside you and build your capacity. We're going to give you some tools and some frameworks that you can use in practice. We're going to be giving you a blueprint that you can put a stake in the ground with. You're going to feel the coach part of me coming in saying, yes, you can do it. You don't need to call the DEI officer. No offense to the DEI officer, but we all need to be able to see our capacity to be able to lead. And then you're going to experience us with our data informed piece, where we're going to talk to you about how you can pick up on what's going on in your actual environment and let that data guide you, as well as our formal assessment. Everything we do is guided by our 4 core values down below. So one of the things that we talked about when we put this webinar together is that we wanted you to understand that we are going to give you a response that's going to defy the normal way that people handle these types of incidents. We are well aware that the way organizations are structured to handle racial incidents or racism is to protect itself from being sued. And so that's why they don't often show up in ways that honor the humanity of people. So we're going to invite you along a journey with us to think about how you can defy the normal way we would respond and really focus in on from a place of healing and reconciliation. How can you respond with urgency, with thoughtfulness for everybody that's involved? And then how can you begin to shift the environment within your organization to honor the collective humanity of everybody that is involved? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the belief systems. And what we realize oftentimes is that what creates these racial incidents in organizations are microaggressions and colorblindness. And many of you may have seen the definitions of microaggressions and colorblindness. I'm going to quickly go over this so that we're all on the same page. Microaggressions are these small, slight comments that people make that create hostile environments. And these comments oftentimes are based on race and gender or religion. And these comments are things like people saying, why do we need to talk about diversity? Or, you know, when we see a room and there's a number of men in the room and a woman is the head of the table and she's speaking and no one is listening to her. And when she says, hey, I'm noticing no one is paying attention to what I'm saying unless my male colleague speaks, and you turn to your colleague and say, oh, don't be so sensitive. Don't be so sensitive. That's an example of a microaggression. Those are instances where you are saying to someone, your lived experience does not matter. I'm going to ignore your account of this inequity, or I'm going to ignore your account of this racial harm by giving you a perfectly logical explanation, or I'm going to change the subject. PLEs, as we like to call them, is when someone comes in and they says, I've experienced racism. If your first response is, oh, it wasn't racism, then you have to check yourself. Because if someone's going to be courageous enough to speak up about racism or sexism or other forms of isms, that person has already thought about what are the repercussions if I do say something. I might be retaliated against. I might miss a promotion. People might not want to hang out with me. People are going to see me as sensitive. So when someone builds up the courage to actually say this happened to them, listen. And if your default response is to have a perfectly logical explanation, you have to ask yourself, why is that my default? Why is it my default to explain away what just happened? And the second way we often step in it is color blindness. I can spend a whole session on color blindness, but I encourage you to check out the work of Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who I'll type it in the chat box later, who's done a lot of work on color blindness and color blindness as a form of racism. Color blindness, I know people think it's in the heart of hearts, like, I don't see color. But when you say that, what happens is that you set yourself up to do a perfectly logical explanation, and you set yourself up for microaggressions, because it's an erasure of the value, identity, and the lived experiences of people of color. CG, Beverly, and I all walk through this world very differently. Are we all human? Yes. Is all of our blood red? Yes. Is there genetically proven that there's more racial differences genetically in blood than not when you're in the same race? Yes, all of that is true. Is racial social construction? Yes, all of that is true. However, we walk through the world very differently. And so it's important for you to be able to see. Thank you, CG, for putting it in the chat box. It's important for you to be able to see my experience as a Black woman, not to be colorblind, to be curious about the way I interact with the world, to be curious about the way our people of color brethren operate and walk through the world. And I would encourage you, if you are a white person, to explore your history, explore your lineage of the way race has impacted you in this country. And what happened when immigration occurred at the top of the century, and your ancestors had to stop speaking their language, stop cooking the foods in order to meld into the concept of whiteness. So we must see color. So the key thing we want to get you to think about with this Act Now framework, and I'm going to get into it with the depths right now. The key thing to consider with this Act Now is that this can happen in a variety of different ways. You can have a racial incident happening in a variety of different ways in your organization. We want to ground you in a specific context, so that as you're going through this session, you're going to be able to think about, okay, here's the context in which Anise and Beverly is speaking. The context that we're speaking in is Bob, a white male, calls Janet, a Black female, angry and aggressive at an all-staff meeting because she has expressed concerns about the organization canceling Juneteenth and Pride events because some stakeholders and collaborators cited them as divisive. So this is the context, and we're honing in on a public event because a lot of times when racial incidents happen, it's not the big thing that we see that goes viral, as Beverly and I talked about, right? It's the everyday acts of racial microaggressions and racism that happens in our staff meetings, that happens during a workshop, that we don't say anything about. We just kind of let it pass. And so what we're going to be inviting you to think about is, one, how do you acknowledge what happened? Two, how do you consult those that are involved? And three, how do you take action and do the real work? But again, this is in the concept of Bob and Janet at a meeting. So the context, we're in a meeting. I am situating myself as the manager of this team. Now, I want you to know that whether or not you're the manager, you can still apply the ACT framework, even if you're not the manager, because we all have power and choice. But I'm situating myself as I'm the manager. We're in a staff meeting. The leaders of the organization have said we're canceling Juneteenth and Pride because people are up and up. Some of our stakeholders and collaborators feel like it's divisive. We're not doing it anymore. Angela has stood up, Janet has stood up in the meeting and said, you know what, this is not okay. She is expressing her concerns that if we say that we are supportive of justice and equity, then why are we canceling these events? I'm frustrated. We're not being true to what we say on paper as an organization. If you've ever seen something like this happen, please just put it in the chat box. I've seen it happen, because I feel like we're seeing this happen nationally in our country, where organizations are backing up on their commitments of equity and justice, and they're not realizing the impact that it's having within their organization. So the first thing that I would do is to speak truth to power. That means that I'm going to name what happened, and I'm going to be honest about what happened and how the harm occurred. That means I'm going to say to the team via email or via in person, both is needed. Last week at our staff meeting, or yesterday at our staff meeting, whenever it happened, there was an interaction that was had between, two staff members. One of our colleagues was called, aggressive and angry as a Black woman. While we don't believe that there was any ill intention that happened, we want to name that this is not okay. We're going to have a community conversation around the impact of this, the importance of honoring all people's perspective, honoring people of color perspectives, and the importance of us remaining true to what we said around equity and justice. So we want to be honest about what happened. We don't want to just send an email. How many of you have seen people just send, as CG likes to say, the racial solidarity email? This incident happened, Black Lives Matter, donate $25 to the Black Lives Matters movement. I mean, nobody ever addresses it. Nobody ever follows up in the staff meeting. Nothing happens. It's just, here's the email and keep hope alive. So part of what I'm saying to you is, one, don't be performative. Speak what actually happened. And we have had to lead organizations through tough racial incidents, but we have really had to push them to name what happened, because sometimes people don't want to name what happened because they have a fear of the person who perpetuated the harm, that they're going to be outcasted. But then what about the person who's the survivor of that? What about the rest of the organization who watched this whole thing play out? You can speak what happened, that there was a racial microaggression that occurred, and we need to be honest that this is what happened in our space, right? That's the first part, to acknowledge what happened truthfully. And then you need to begin to consult with those involved. There's a way that we can speak the truth and not harm anybody in the process, meaning that speaking the truth, let me backtrack and say, speaking the truth may cause some people to feel harm, but that doesn't mean we don't speak the truth, because part of this is a learning for the person who perpetuated the harm. And I'm using the term survivor and perpetrator for a reason, because when someone experiences a racial microaggression or any form of racism or sexism, it is a violent act on that person. And they are, in essence, coming out of a situation where they're trying to decide how to survive this incident, the public incident. So the first thing you want to be doing is to check in with the survivor and encourage them, hey, believe yourself, this really did happen. And we want to encourage people to acknowledge their power and their ability to choose their path. They may choose to say, I don't want to come into work tomorrow. I need a couple of days off to come back into myself. You know what? I don't want to talk to Bob tomorrow. One of the biggest mistakes we make is we try to force people to have a mediation session with the person that harmed them the next day. I might not want to have a conversation with Bob the next day. I might need a couple of days to really sit with the fact that this has happened to me yet again as a Black woman in the organization. They should also know their choices, that they can choose to file a complaint or not, right? These are all choices that the survivor has. From the perpetrator lens, one of the things that we like to say is that a person is not frozen in time for the one thing that they did. I'm going to drop an article in the chat box before we go that I wrote on healing requires honesty. And there's a whole four-step process that someone who inflicts racial harm could use for themselves. And a part of that is to acknowledge what happened. And the biggest issue we have is when you tell someone they did a racial microaggression, they want to step back, and then, it's World War III sometimes with people. But it's important to help people understand we all fall short. We have all been socially programmed. We're trying to help Bob understand why, because Janet is Black, you chose to call her aggressive and angry because she was expressing her frustrations with this shit. What about her Blackness made you use those terms? And then I like to say the word repent. And for people who have religious hurt, I want to encourage you to come away from that and hear me, because the word repent means to not do something again. It means to turn away from something. So in that case, Bob needs to acknowledge what he has done, make an internal commitment to himself not to do this again, and to be thinking about how he's going to make amends and how he's going to restore his relationship with Janet, right? Because this is what reconciliation is about. How can I make amends? How can I apologize and do the self-work so I don't do this again? And so the key thing I want people to think about here is, even if you're not the manager, you could still encourage. You can still have this conversation with the survivor. You can still follow up and have this conversation with your colleague about the importance of acknowledging what they're doing and making amends. The third group of people that we often leave out is the residual impact, which is everybody else in that meeting has watched what happened. There are some people who may have identities as folks of color or of LGBTQ, and we need to acknowledge the residual harm that could be sitting on those folks in that space. So that's why it's important for you to speak the truth of what happened and offer support. We're going to have a conversation about this at our next staff meeting. If you don't feel qualified to do it as the manager, invite somebody else in to lead that conversation from your ombudsman or from your human resources, or even just a trusted colleague who's good at facilitating difficult conversations. Invite them in and have a conversation so that you all as a group can talk about what just happened. And that is going to mean offering support. That means offering resources to offices that they can go to in the university to feel supported, or counseling. And then next steps as a team. At our next meeting, we're going to have a conversation about what happened. And I want us to talk about revisiting our norms as a team on how do we create a meeting space where people's humanity is honored, and how do we create a meeting space so that people can disagree and share their concerns and bring their challenges to us as an organization, and they not be accused of being angry. They not fear having a racial microaggression towards them. And so it's important for you to paint the possibility of reconciliation. You have to paint the possibility that we can heal as a group of people. And again, even if you're not the manager, you can pick up on any one of these steps and talk to your colleague or talk to your manager about it, or convene people at lunch. Hey, did you saw what happened? I'd like for us to join together at lunch and talk about what happened. How do we want to treat each other as a group of people? We all can do this. It's not just waiting on the manager. I'm wearing the manager hat, but you all can be a part of this process of taking action. So it's acknowledge what happened, consult those involved, the survivor, the perpetrator, and the group. And then the third thing is you have to take action and do the real work. What do I mean by that? Boundaries have to be set in an organization that this behavior is not okay, right? So a great boundary is we are a community that honors the humanity of everyone. This is a space where people can come in and voice their concerns. This is also, in order for us to really be able to have a community that operates like that, we need to think about our own social programmings. And we also need to think about what does it mean to have norms where we respect and honor people and not use terminology that harms people. When you call somebody angry and aggressive, that's harmful terminology. That's not any sort of language where you're inviting people into the space to have a true dialogue of disagreement. You can disagree with people without using those terms, right? But we know those are racialized terms used against Black women and people of color. The second thing you want to do is to set expectations for bystanders, meaning the expectations of people in the organization is if you see something, say something, but we should check in with our colleagues. when we see something happening, we should check in. And anybody in the organization can report an incident to human resources. It doesn't necessarily have to be the actual person that experienced it. You can report it. But one of the things you have to say as a boundary, as a pathway for healing, is that we don't have a work culture that sits back and remains silent while people are mistreated or dehumanized in a particular work environment. And the last thing I'll say here is we have to build the pathways for healing and reconciliation. So again, what are the next steps for healing your internal community? Having a group conversation at your next team meeting, and also being open to continue the conversation. How many of you have been in a situation where some racism has happened and nobody wants to talk about it? And so maybe the pasty email goes out that says it's solidarity, you know, keep hope alive. And then nobody ever brings it up at the staff meeting. Nobody ever brings it up. And everyone's looking like, did we all not just experience this racism, this racial incident? You have to be willing as people within the organization to continue the conversation, which is the incident happened week 1. Week 2, we talk about it at our team meeting the next time. We talk about collective norms. We talk about this being a space of inclusivity. If we need to do a training on microaggressions, we do a training on microaggressions. Then we come back and revisit and say, are we living up to norms that honor the collective humanity of people in our organization? And it's right, and it is gaslighting. Right? And so we need to be willing to say, we are on a pathway for healing and reconciliation. Here are our core values as an organization. We're going to continue the conversation. We want to create a space where everyone can feel heard, seen, and respected. For people who might be thinking, ooh, this feels like a lot of work. It is a lot of work. And you know why it is? It's because you are taking a healing and reconciliation approach. If you want to just do the email or you just want to report it to HR, that's the norm. But that is going to create a negative climate in your organization, which is going to grow into a larger problem. So we're putting forth here to you some options, some things to think about. How can I show people in the organization when racism happens, it doesn't have to be the end of us? That we can have a space where we can do healing work with the person that survived, do healing work with Bob, who created the incident with his comment, invite Bob back into the space, let Bob know that your life is not over, that you had this slip up. Let's talk about making amends, and then how do we bring the group along? So I know I went fairly quickly, but you all can hit the replay. And Dr. Heiser will drop the framework in the chat box for you in a second. I'm going to turn it over to Beverly, who is going to talk to you about some tips to think about this from her perspective as the person who is set in the seat of investigation. So let me stop my video and invite Beverly to turn on her video and come in.
It's not letting me start my video. It's saying I can't start it. But I will go ahead and can everybody hear me? I will go ahead and talk about, okay, here it is. I will go ahead and talk about tips. And so to piggyback off of what Dr. Fisher is talking about, as far as how do we act now? If you're the manager or you're the bystander, how do you act now? One thing you need to understand is you need to know your obligation. In most organizations, depending on your role as a manager, as an HR person, you are considered a responsible employee that is obligated to report any of these kinds of incidents to the diversity office. So it's not just about having a conversation with the person who did it or having a conversation about with the survivor. It's also reporting that information. That information is critical so the organization can understand where does it stand on all of these types of issues and things. The other thing is you need to understand where and how to utilize the resources available. You may not have the ability to have the conversations, but there are resources and there are people that can assist with that. And so once it's reported, you need to understand, okay, where do I go so that I can have those conversations and start that healing process with my team, with the survivor, with the perpetrator. And you must stay informed and educated as to about all of this in this space, about all of the different things that can create these uncomfortable situations and these uncomfortable conversations and this racism that happens on a daily basis. And even though they may be small, when it's happening to several people throughout the day, multiple times, you know, it becomes bigger issues, and it affects the morale of the organization. And so you're not going to know all of the answers. You're not going to know how to handle all of the situations. But if you do your part and making sure that it gets reported, that you get in the proper resources, and you're informed and educated, it will go a long way in helping to start weeding some of this stuff out of our organizations. And I'll pass it back over to Dr. Fisher.
Okay. Dr. Heiser has dropped in the chat box the handout for ACT, which basically walks through how you can create this plan and use this in your organization. And I'm going to invite Beverly back on camera, and we're going to go into some question and answer. You know, we spent some time walking through what you could do, but I'm sure many of you have some questions that you want to get answered. We're going to take maybe 1 or 2 questions from people who registered, and then I see Barb Wells has her hand up. We'll take some questions from the audience. So feel free to drop them in the chat box now, and then they will be on our list of what to take once Dr. Heiser gets through the original questions.
All right, are you 2 fantastic women ready? All right. So one of our first questions that someone submitted when they were registering is this idea of, how do you hold someone accountable who is really reluctant to understand how they're in the wrong or how they have caused harm?
So if I can take that question. So one of the ways that you hold people accountable is you use the policies of the organization, and you use and you set behavior expectations. And so it's not about whether or not the person does their job well. It's they're using the appropriate language as work, you know, at work. And that can be verbal, it can be body language. You know, and you hold them accountable to that. And you explain to them of what the behavior that is expected, and what and that if the behavior that they continue to display is shown, then they will be corrective actions around that. You don't get into a debate around well, I was just joking, or I was just that. You don't go down that road with them. You be very clear, and you stay to it, and you stick to it. Sometimes it's difficult, but that's the way you hold.
I would add that Dr. Fisher and I have asked hundreds of people questions about their environments that they work in. And one of the questions that we often ask is, you know, was it clearly explained to you what your role in creating an inclusive community was, right? Like, have clear expectations been shared with you around creating an inclusive community? Have you been provided the training to create and sustain inclusive communities, right, as a part of your work environment? And oftentimes the answer that we hear is no, that was not something that I was told was expected of me. And so if I hear you, Beverly, it's almost like expectations are at the beginning of the process. Like, this is the kind of culture and community we're here and we're about, and we're creating, and we're working to sustain. And then the accountability is that policy piece, right? So you start at the beginning, so it should never be a surprise to anybody, by laying out those expectations. And then you hold people responsible for those expectations, leaning all the way into policy and documentation and HR when necessary, which is great, because I know that was another question that we had in the chat, is like, someone was curious, like, at what point does HR get involved in the process? So Beverly and Denise, you know, Dr. Fisher, if you want to jump in on the last question,
Yeah,
before
I'll
we
just
jump
be
into
quick
this
and
next
say,
one?
if you are one of the people that are sitting here today listening or playing the replay, if your organization has not talked about what does it mean to create an inclusive space and you do not have norms around how to honor each other's humanity, make an appointment with your supervisor. And if you are the supervisor, make the appointment with yourself to have the conversation about how do we set shared norms and expectations, because that's being proactive before it happens as the accountability piece. That is what I wanted to click from the last question.
So someone had asked earlier when they were logging in that they were hoping to learn, like, at what point do you get HR involved? And so would you be willing to speak to that, Beverly, and then Dr. Fisher?
I think you should always make HR involved when there are these things happening. And HR needs to make sure that they're your first point of contact, your first resource. But part of the problem in HR is that we're not often told until it has escalated. And once we find out, it's been something that has been going on for 6 months. And versus when it initially happens, if something makes you feel uncomfortable, if you see something that's not appropriate, don't just think it's gonna go away. These things often escalate. And you should say something immediately, just so that HR can be aware. And sometimes they can intervene, and it can be a training, it could be information, and you can nip it in the bud quickly. But we're not notified until it has become a crisis now.
So I'm hearing communicate often.
Yes.
And throughout. Don't
Yes.
let it compile all up at the end and be like, here is my novel on what has been happening.
Yes. Yes.
Use HR as a resource. Got it. So the last question that we'll take from the registrations or for the webinar is how do we keep our motivation to stay involved and sustained in this work when the harm happening around us can feel overwhelming? Dr. Fisher, I feel like that's right for you.
No, I think it's real, right? Some of us are in environments, and I think this connects a little bit to Rosa's question in the box of what happens when you're in an organization and they keep sweeping incidents under the rug. That's the reality of some places where people are working, because folks are not involving people like Beverly and Human Resources to address this, and people are just quietly allowing racism and microaggressions to happen in public spaces. And so, number one, I want to first say to you that, I am sad to hear that this is happening to you, because it is not okay. Nobody should be in a work environment where they're being subjected to harm on a daily basis. So it's not okay. And I don't want to normalize it as being okay. Number one. Number two, I want to encourage you to share your challenges and your frustrations with the leaders of your organizations, as well as with Human Resources, which you can make an anonymous report, or you can make a report with your name on it. And the reason I say to share your frustrations is because part of it is we have to be willing to speak truth to power about what's going on in the organization and help people understand the residual impact. I also would say you don't have to go at this alone. You can talk with your colleagues, and it could be a group of you all that go to sit down with a leader team. So you don't have to do this by yourself. You can go with other people. The next thing I would say is that it's important for you to ensure that you're feeding your own spirit with some level of sanctuary, whether that's with a therapist, whether that's with a coach, where you are working with someone to have a physical release of the emotional stress and tax that's happening from you being in an environment that is toxic. So you do need to have some of your own self-care. And the last thing is you have to determine, is this the environment you want to work in? If you've made interventions, if you've been the person that's been, stepping up and standing out in meetings saying we should behave better, if you're the person that's always intervening and no one's listening to you, HR has decided to turn their back, then you have to love and honor yourself enough to say, is this the right place for me? And it doesn't mean you quit tomorrow, because, you know, people have financial obligations, but you might need to begin to think about what your exit strategy is, because this is a place that is sucking you dry. And with all that's going on in our world, we can choose whether or not we want to be in an environment. If that environment is no longer honoring who you are and it's conducive to your soul and your spirit, then at some point you have to make the choice, like, hey, I've tried everything. Maybe it's time for me to make an exit and go, you know, find a place that can honor my humanity. But again, note, I didn't say leave tomorrow. There's a bunch of different steps, but for some people, if you're the person that's receiving the harm and racism, it might be that point where you're hitting eject, right? It just depends on who you are and where you are in the space of it, and are you being harmed in detrimental ways? Because sometimes that is the story for some people. And Beverly, I don't know if you have anything that you would want to add.
I agree with everything you say, and like you said, know your capacity, know how it's weighing on you, you may not want to, you may pick and choose where you feel like you can have the most impact, and then you have to assess, does this organization align with my beliefs and my values? And it's a way to do it where you can do it in a way that it doesn't cause you stress and cause you to be upset. And understanding who to help you do this is not going to be something you can do by yourself. You have to have allies that can help you.
I would also say it's not always possible to heal in the place where harm was caused.
Yes.
And so some people can't. Some people could look and say, okay, this was a moment or an incident, and I have the ability and the resources and the community, whatever you need to heal, to move forward from that space. And some people are in that space and they're like, you know, I think that this is just going to sit in my spirit until I can find myself into a new space like that. I cannot fully heal in the place that caused the harm. And so, you know yourself best. You do your own self-work to know what the right choice is for you, but we offer that for consideration as well. So we have 4 minutes left. Dr. Fisher, do you want to go back to the slides and wrap us up for the rest of the session? And while you make that transition, I will share that we really love hearing what you think about the webinar. So I'm going to drop a link, and it's really just for you to tell us, like, hey, what'd you think? What'd you learn? And also if you'd like to stay connected with us or not. So I will drop that in the chat now.
Thank you. And feel free, if you have any lingering questions, drop them in the chat box, and I'll try to save us like a minute or two at the end so that we can cover them. So we just offered the first part of the framework, the ACT: acknowledge, consult with those involved, take actions, and do the work. In July, join Beverly and I roughly 3 weeks from now. We're going to continue this conversation, and we're going to talk about the now part of the framework, which is going to be looking at how do you begin to navigate healing? How do you lead people on the healing journey? Then we will be talking about how do you begin to open the door for multiple levels of reconciliation? And then how do you continue to work until inclusion becomes the true source of the climate of your environment? So join us on the 13th. You'll get an email full of lots of resources from us. If you want to learn how to lead better and to do this work, we invite you to consider our team capacity building series, where we dig a little bit deeper into building the capacity of teams to lead for equity and justice and provide strategic plans for that, as well as assessments to measure your journey along the way. 10% off if you choose to take that option in the next 30 days. And then we end with a quote by Bell Hooks, who is one of my sheroes, is true resistance begins with people confronting pain, whether it's yours or someone else's, and wanting to do something to change it. And so for us, we consider our free webinar series a resistance movement, because we felt an urgency in our spirit to offer our services to provide people these, quick frameworks and toolkits, so that we can start to build an army of people in our country that knows how to effectively lead for equity and justice. And we believe that if we shared this knowledge with people, whether or not they hired us or not, but we gave them some source of resource, some tool, some strategy, that we can begin to shift the pain that was happening to people in different environments, and that we would be doing something to change it, but then we would be giving other people tools to actually change what might be happening in their environment. So with that, that's the end of our session here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I was able to save 2 minutes in case there were any other questions. And thank you. I am honored because there are some people in the chat box who I've worked with across a variety of industries who've dealt with heavy racial public incidents, who have applied many of these same principles, and they're on the other side of it because they chose to take the long journey and honor the humanity of people that are involved. So it's great seeing some of those faces in the chat box today. And if you have any other questions, we'll hang back and I'll stop the recording at this point. Thank you all for joining us.